Okay, I'd like to introduce our two sitting congressmen whose districts both overlap into Seattle. The first is Congressman Adam Smith, who's from the 9th District of Washington. And
that's yours.
The second candidate is Jim McDermott, who represents Congressional District number 7.
How can you assure that more minority businesses get contracts for federal projects?
Thank you very much. The question was, how can we assure that more minority businesses will get more, you said federal contracts, but I think it should go beyond federal contracts into state as well. First of all, I want to apologize, not for being a Seattle Seahawks fan or for being a Richard Sherman fan, but I was at my son's soccer game. It started raining in the middle of it, and I didn't have, traffic went very bad. I didn't have time to get home and change, so I'm both soaking wet and underdressed, but very happy to be here. This is a major, major issue and something that we've been working on, first of all, on the state level, to make sure that women and minority-owned businesses get the percentage of the contracts that they're supposed to get under federal law. We actually have pretty good law on both the federal and state level. It's simply not followed. My office has worked in particular to focus on the Department of Transportation and the problem with a number of projects not meeting that requirement. On the federal level, we're doing the same thing. We're working with a specific group of minority and women-owned businesses to put pressure on all levels of government to follow the law. We're cautiously optimistic that the Department of Transportation here in the state is going to start doing better on that. I was at a Tabor 100 event the other night and mentioned that they hadn't been doing that well, and the Department of Transportation was present, and they were greatly offended that I had said that, called me up to say so, and I said, well, start doing better, and I won't say things like that. So, and they're reaching out to us, and they're reaching out to different groups, but look, the law's in place, we have to enforce it, and it's also worth mentioning that this is incredibly important for the government to make sure that it gets the best people doing its work. If we have discriminatory practices that don't allow women and minority businesses, then the government is missing out on highly qualified businesses who can provide high quality service at a better price. It's about fair competition in addition to following the law.
I agree with everything that Adam said. I can't think what I would add to it. The real problem here is we've passed the laws. When I was in the state legislature and when he was there, we passed minority and women-owned businesses legislation requiring that people get their chance to do it. There are federal laws that require it. It is clearly a question of enforcement. And one of the problems that we have is that as the budget is cut, what they do is they cut out enforcement of regulations. That's where the real problem occurs. Whether you're talking about environmental questions, or you're talking about labor questions, or you're talking about who gets the contracts. It's very easy, as many of you know, for people to get somebody sort of as a front person, but really it's a big company behind that's doing it, and it really isn't minority and women-owned businesses. It's big companies using one or two people to make it look like that. They're not really getting a start in building their own business. And in this country, we're all a country of immigrants. We all started from nowhere, and we starting small and building and building and building. And if you don't continue to allow people to get in at the bottom and build, you don't continue to build this society in the way that we have been strong in the past. The energy of this country has come from immigrants. There are people who came from someplace else and they have no place to go back to. They've got to make it work here. That's been true when the Irish and the Germans came in the 1850s. It's true today. And we need to give people access to getting started in the process.
%80 of African American males have criminal records. Are you for rehabilitating and reintegrating those with criminal records, including felony records, by lifting the restrictions on them receiving food stamps, Social Security income, federal education aid, state grants, federal housing aid, federal jobs, business licenses, and restoring their rights to serve on juries and to vote?
One of the biggest problems in a democracy is that everyone has the right to vote. But sometimes, having given them the right to vote, we then put up ways to stop them from voting. And there are people in this country who believe that this country ought to be the way it was in 1789, which was when people like me, white men who owned property, were the only ones who voted. Everybody else stood back. And our process has been gradually to add people to the process over time. But what you're seeing today is a concentrated effort to suppress the voting of people, of the lower income people, people of color, and this issue of people coming out of jail and not being able to get their civil rights back is just one more example. It is wrong. We should give people, once you've served your time, apparently you've paid for your crime, right? That's what the law says. But in fact, it turns out that you pay for the rest of your life because you can't vote, and you can't get loans in schools, and you can't get all sorts of benefits that are eligible, that any other American is eligible for. It is an absolute wrong that ought to be righted. People should be given their civil rights back when they come out of jail.
Thank you. First of all, I totally agree with Jim on the voter suppression issue. This is a major, major problem nationally, efforts to deny people the right to vote. The Supreme Court, bizarrely, just made a positive decision striking down one of those voter suppression laws from Wisconsin. That's a positive step, but many more are needed. And yes, to answer your question, I think that once you get out of prison, you ought to have those rights restored. And you ought to have the ability to vote, the ability to, get benefits, the ability to find a job. Folks have to be rehabilitated. In fact, there's a company in the south end of my district in Kent that makes gourmet popcorn. It'd be a better story if I could remember the name of it. Pop, yeah. It was hard to remember, I guess. And it was a gentleman who was a felon who came out and started the business. He specifically hires people who have come out of prison because of his experience, but it is an unbelievably successful company. People can be rehabilitated. They need and deserve to get that second chance at that. And I really think that's important. The final point I want to make about this, we incarcerate way too many people in the United States of America. So this is a problem beyond just making sure we rehabilitate these people when they come out. We have a prison population that is too high, unsustainable, and we lock up too many people when there are alternatives to incarceration for dealing with crimes that are committed. So I think we need to deal with this comprehensively. I've worked with a variety of people. Lim Howell here locally has been very aggressive working with me on the mandatory minimum problem. There are federal laws on mandatory minimums for any number of different drug crimes that are A, discriminatory, and B, far too great. So we lock up too many people, but once they are locked up, they come out, we got to rehabilitate them. We have to give them a chance, and certainly right at the top of that list is to let them exercise their franchise and vote.
Thank you. The Seattle Housing Authority, through a program called Stepping Forward, is proposing a new approach to rent structure and employment support for what they call workable households. How can the federal government allow housing authorities, the Seattle Housing Authority, to implement policies that hurt vulnerable communities with federal money?
What was the very last part of that?
Through a federal program, pretty much, yes.
I think you're talking about sort of a comprehensive approach to access to housing. And actually, Yesler Terrace, which is, partially federally funded, but also funded on the Seattle level, is an example of where they want to go with this. Yes, provide housing, but also provide an entire community of services, job training, education, childcare, everything that's necessary basically to make a sustainable community beyond just access to housing, to improve the quality of our public housing. So there is a federal program to do that. I think we're one of the models in the nation here that they're working on over at Yesler, and this is a many years project in terms of the different pieces of it that they're going to be opening up. But I think those projects are great. You have got to integrate services. Housing is terrific, but you need to build it with the ability to find a job, the ability for your children to get a high quality of education, childcare where necessary, transportation where necessary. So I think a comprehensive federal program along those lines makes a great deal of sense. Like I said, we're doing it at Yesler. I think we should look for other opportunities to do that comprehensive housing program as well, and the federal government has a strong role to play.
Just a quick follow-up. The Stepping Forward program, are you familiar with it, the initiative?
I'm not, actually. I apologize.
Okay. Jim,
I thought the Stepping Forward program was part of this larger comprehensive approach that the federal government is doing.
It's an initiative by the Seattle Housing Authority to basically graduate rent payments. Are you familiar with that program?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I'd be happy to be supportive of that as well. So.
You would support it?
No, sorry. Like I said, the public housing, it has to be affordable, and I think what the Seattle Housing Authority is trying to do is figure out how to do more mixed use. I don't know that that's the right approach, because right now people still can't afford housing. So I think we need to make sure that it's affordable. And I would say this, I don't know enough about the Stepping Forward project. I will look into it and get you a bit more comprehensive answer.
Thank you.
In 1980, we were spending about $40 billion at the federal level in housing and a variety of things. What we have seen has been a gradual reduction over the last 30 years. And basically, we have pulled out federal support of housing at the federal level. I mean, Section 8s, there's a long waiting list everywhere you go. What has stepped in its place has been state housing and local housing and housing initiatives on the ballot here and everything else. We have pushed all that responsibility down to the local level. What's going on, I only know from reading the newspapers. That has not been brought to us. It's not a federal program that's allowing them to raise the rents to make it hard for people to stay in housing. It is clear that in this society, we need a housing program, a major housing program to move back forward, because you have to live 40 miles away to find basic housing you could afford, and then you have no bus to get to work. So not only is it housing, but it's transportation. Those two issues are tied together in terms of having a workforce that can work in the city and take the jobs here. But we at the federal level right now, we're in the minority. If Adam and I were in charge, there'd be a hell of a lot of money for transit and some for housing as well.
Can I just follow up? I understand that the Stepping Forward initiative is in the federal program, but is there anything that you can do to basically address this initiative and challenge it?
What you're pointing out is your job. Your job is to come to us and tell us what the Seattle Housing Authority is doing, because I don't think Adam knows. He doesn't sit on the banking committee. I don't sit on the banking committee, so we don't know. We pass laws, then they're implemented at the local level, and we really need you to come and tell us what's going on, and I welcome that opportunity.
If it's okay, if I could take another stab at this, because I'm not familiar specifically with Stepping Forward. I am familiar with the issue you're talking about, and what the city is wrestling with is they want to attract investors to build this housing. And this is a major battle and a major challenge in Southeast Seattle, the portion of Seattle that I represent in the 9th District, is there's people who want more market rate housing, so people will make more investments and build more. But there's the concern, if you go more market rate, then you price the very people that you're trying to help out of the market. and I'll confess, I don't know what the right balance is, okay? But I will also say that if you don't set up the proper incentives to make sure that people will make investments and build this type of housing, then you've got a problem on that side as well. I think that's what the city of Seattle is trying to balance. I have absolutely no idea whether or not they're doing it right. It sounds to me like they're not, but you know, we're happy to look into that. But that's the reason they propose things like that, is how do you get people to make the investments to build the housing? Part of it is to introduce some more market rate housing. What's the right balance? I'll tell you right now, as I look around Southeast Seattle, there's still a ton of people who can't afford the rent. So it seems to me that going up is not the right way to go, but that's the balance they're trying to strike.
On housing and urban development projects, a certain percentage of funds are for hiring and training local low-income workers, but not all development projects comply with these regulations. How can the federal government hold state and local governments accountable?
Well, part of what is clear, I think, you are living in an era when you have people in charge of the government who do not believe in the government doing its job. So the way that the Republicans have handled this has been by cutting off the money so the department lays off people, and the people they lay off are always the enforcement people. My belief is you have to put more money into enforcement. That's the only way. You have wage theft. You've got all kinds of stuff going on in labor where people are losing because there is no enforcement of the laws that are in place. We have good laws. It is enforcement that's the issue, and the sort of backdoor way to undo the law is just don't enforce it. So what we've got going on in this country now is a backdoor way of taking away what seems to be in the law. It ought to be there, it says it's there, but you can't get it. And we hear all the time in every congressional office about projects that suddenly don't seem to be following the rules. And at that point, we can only talk to the Department of Housing, and they say, well, we don't have enough people to cover all the projects, and so everybody's backing around. The issue is putting more money in there so they can hire the inspectors they need to do.
I agree with that answer. The only thing that I would add is one of the things that my office has done, again, in the specific area that we were focused on was on the Department of Transportation project, is actually to reach out directly to the contractors and the people who are doing the hiring and try to encourage them to follow the law and to work with them directly to sort of build on those relationships. This is not always successful, as you might imagine, because we don't have any particular leverage other than saying, hey, it would be better for the community if you did the right thing and try to build on those relationships. But it can be effective. Ultimately, what we want to do is, like Jim said, have the federal people in place to enforce the law. So in the example that you cited, they hire workers, women and minority workers, for these jobs like the law says they're supposed to. But you can also go beyond that and go directly to the contractors, because a lot of where these problems come in is the contractors just hire who they know and they don't follow the law. Now the government, whether it's federal or state, is supposed to be there and say, hey, you're violating the law, you're supposed to fix this. But if you can foster those relationships so that those contractors will just do it and not have to rely on the enforcement, that would be better all the way around.
If elected, will you meet with our coalition within 60 days to discuss our priorities? And please, just a yes or no.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to also recognize State Senator Jeannie Cole Wells, who's here. She can't stay with us for the rest of the time, but she wanted to please acknowledge her.
Right here, right?
On the stage, we have Brendan Colding, He's from the 34th District, State Representative, Position 2. Can you please raise your hand? The second candidate we have is Daniel Bretsky, 37th District, State Representative, Position 1. The first question is, will you support a statewide increase of the minimum wage to $15 an hour? And whoever has the mic closest to them can answer.
I do support a statewide income tax. I'm not sure that...
I'm sorry, I asked for an increase in the minimum wage.
Minimum wage. I'm Daniel Bretsky, running for the 37th District, Position 1. And I support an increase in minimum wage based upon, on a local basis and a regional basis. I not support a minimum wage increase across this whole state of Washington. The state comprises of multiple districts, multiple microeconomies, and I think that we need to address minimum wages based upon cost of living in areas where it's more expensive than.
I also believe that we should have a minimum wage increase. I have not seen any data to support $15 being the optimal figure, though. I believe we need to do some rigorous scientific research to determine the precise hourly wage that will both increase people's salaries and not price them out of the employers that need to keep them on board.
How do you propose to fund education? Given the McCleary decision, how will you ensure that those additional resources are equitably targeted and distributed to low-income schools?
I support, again, I'm Daniel Bretsky, 37th District, and I support what we've talked about as a levy swap, where we're taking local school districts pass levies which support local education. Those levies need to be converted to a state levy, and then the money comes back to the district which passed it. I think we need to actually have other options about how to provide education. We lose 50% of the students from the time they go to school to the time they graduate. We need to be able to educate people differently as opposed to the same way that Seattle School District or all the other different school districts do. And one way to do that is through different types of options for education, for charter schools, private schools that address individual issues, vocational schools. We need to do more than just raise taxes to pay for what's the perceived gap. We need to actually change the way we educate people.
It was actually the McCleary decision that inspired me to run for office in the first place. I believe we need to enable families with choices as to where they send their children to school. There are currently 13 states that offer a tax credit for contributions to private schools, which are then used to help students go there and save the state money. And with only a few seconds left, I'll just say that's my plan.
Will you support the passage of the Family Unity Act, formerly known as the Trust Act, to stop the practice of local law enforcement detaining people without documents?
Yes.
Yes.
What do you think are the most pressing issues for immigrants, refugees, and communities of colors, and what can you commit to do in terms of addressing them?
I would say the most pressing issue is access to quality education in however they seek to pursue that for their children. Also, a major issue that I'm aware of that exists out there is sometimes these communities don't feel like they are heard by local municipal government. And I believe it starts with reaching out to these communities and making sure that they have a platform to express their concerns, and then for local government to prove that these concerns have been heard and are being addressed.
So I'm really for responsible government, and I think responsible government means that it's responsible for all of the individuals of the society, including immigrants, foreign nationals, whoever makes up our society. For instance, different cultures have different issues about how to finance housing. Muslim cultures generally do not borrow money to buy a house. They need to have some other way to do it. So we need to have ways to look at and addressing issues differently than the typical ways that the government has done it sort of in currently. So I'm for, listen to people, try to find issues and address them.
Homeownership is often the only way people of color can develop real generational wealth. In the 90s, the Housing Trust Fund had $200 million for 2 years, which helped people of color to own homes by providing them with down payments and low-interest loans. In the 2000s, this got cut to $50 million, and last year was cut to zero. We support funding the Housing Trust Fund in order to provide people of color with more equitable and affordable housing.
Yes, I support the Housing Trust Fund, and I would even go further to say that maybe we can do something that actually, instead of loans, actually gives grants based upon local micro investments into bonds that support housing for people of color.
My answer is yes.
If you are elected, will you commit to meet with the coalition within 60 days to discuss our issues? Just a brief yes or no.
Yes, and I'm going to say thank you for having us here today, and I will listen to not only the coalition but to any groups that would want to educate me about what issues are in the community.
Yes, and thank you also.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.